I get a lot of points, but I'll look out for that.
All righty, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome once again to Monumental Moments at the National Capital Trolley Museum. My name is Josh. I'm the Outreach Director for the museum. It is great seeing this absolutely overcapacity crowd here, but do appreciate everybody being here throughout the course of the afternoon, seeing all of you being part of this great event. Truly wonderful, truly special, so really appreciate everybody being here. Before we get into this final presentation of the afternoon, just going to have a couple quick housekeeping things. If you do need to exit for any reason, as always, it'll be through the two doors from which you entered. We will be saving questions for the end of the presentation. We'll take some time to answer as many questions as we can. You may have also noticed by the door over on that side, we have a very lovely poster commemorating the event. Those posters are available for purchase from the museum store. We also have a collection of historic books available at greatly discounted prices. Yes. If you're a museum member, your museum gift shop discount does apply for those books. If you're not already a museum member, highly encourage you to do so. Not only do you get discounts in our gift shop, you get free admission to the museum, access to exclusive member events, and also access to the recordings of these lectures, which will be sent out following these afternoon's presentations. Now, these final two presenters that we have here probably need no introduction, but they're getting one anyway. Thom and Andy Sandweiss, both transplants to the city, but have really made Washington their home, covering transportation in this city, from the known to the unknown, bringing to light all the fascinating things that there is to know about transit here in the city. They have joined forces for this great presentation on the history of mainline railroads in Washington. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Andy Sandweiss and Thom.
Thank you. I'm going to stand over here. Well, good afternoon, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of today's lineup. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the National Capital Trolley Museum for having us here. My name is Andy Sandweiss.
I'm Thom DeBow.
And today we're here to speak to you about the history of railways in the DC region, how it's impacted our city, our metropolitan area, our country, even the world to a certain degree. There's a lot to go over, not a whole lot of time to do it in, so I think we better get started, right? So
yes.
I'll pass it to Thom.
So, Washington, D.C. today, we have one of the busiest train stations in North America. We have thousands of people every day that come in here by train. That's commuters, that's intercity passengers. But we want to start at the very beginning. Now, in 1825, the world's first railway opened, and just 5 years later, the first railway in the United States opened. That is on this map, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I just wanted to give you an overview of what trains look like today. So, the blue is CSX, that's a freight company. The red is tracks owned by Amtrak, and the gray on this map is just some of the abandoned railways in the region, specifically the ones that we're going to talk about today. All right, so I mentioned that by the 1830s, the United States had trains. Just for some context, what did the US look like? Well, there were states on both sides of the Mississippi River, but the Great West had not really been settled yet. Washington, D.C. was a very small beginning city. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, the Capitol was still under construction. I mean, the Constitution was only 40 years old at this point. There was the city of Washington, there was Georgetown, there was Alexandria, but nothing like what we have today. Most of the district was still just forest. So, in 1830, the first passenger train in the United States runs. It is operated by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which runs from Baltimore to Ellicott City, about 6 miles away. But it eventually did reach the Ohio River, which is what the Ohio actually refers to, and ultimately went all the way to Chicago, St. Louis. By 1835, they had already built a branch line serving Washington, D.C. So this was one of the first places in the country and in the world to get trains. So as Jake mentioned earlier, it wasn't Union Station. The trains, they entered the district and they mostly ran down streets to a spot at 2nd and Pennsylvania Northwest. That's right in front of where the Capitol is today. They were there for about 20 years and then they moved to a different location, which is on New Jersey Avenue. Again, still right in front of the Capitol. This was that New Jersey Avenue station. It was beautiful. It's not there anymore because on its site today is just a little green area, a park with this bell tower. It's like right between where Union Station and the Capitol are today. So, the Baltimore and Ohio was built partially with money from the state of Maryland. And because Maryland wanted a return on their investment, and because they had the power to make laws, they made a law that said that only the Baltimore and Ohio could reach Washington, D.C. So for decades, if you wanted to take the train to D.C., this was the only railroad you could. Eventually in the 1870s, they built a branch to Harper's Ferry as well, and so all of their trains would go from New York first to D.C., then to Chicago or St. Louis. They couldn't really compete in time with other railroads, so they competed in luxury. Some of the most luxurious trains ever to run on rails anywhere were B&O trains, and a lot of famous people took them. So Abraham Lincoln took the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad to his inauguration in D.C. He also took the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad out of D.C. For his funeral train after his assassination. This is that train. The Baltimore and Ohio is, a real fixture of D.C. Railroad history. If we go to the next slide, the deadliest train accident in D.C. history ever was on the B&O at a station called Terracotta, which is today's Fort Totten. Just kind of crazy. Metro's worst accident is also at that same site. And those lines still exist today. They are owned by that freight company CSX I mentioned, but the line from Baltimore to DC is now what we know as the Mark Camden line, whereas the line to Frederick and Harper's Ferry is the Brunswick line. So if you're taking the train to Laurel or Baltimore, you are actually on some of the oldest tracks in the country. You might notice that a little bit. Go ahead.
Now, as Thom mentioned, the B&O was the first railroad to reach DC, but it would soon face some pretty stark competition. In the 1850s, the Bowie family of Prince George's County, that's in southern Maryland, decided they wanted to have a train that goes to southern Maryland, particularly a man named Owen Bowie, whose first name would lend itself to the town of Odenton, that's a stop on the Penn line, on the Mark line, and Bowie, the town of Bowie, Maryland. Now, they eventually got in 1853 the state to agree to give them a contract to build a railroad to southern Maryland through Upper Marlboro to a place called Pope's Creek. And while this was fun and all, the real market here wasn't so much southern Maryland, it was the capital, it was DC. But there was a couple of problems. One, that they, as Thom mentioned, the state of Maryland wanted there to be a monopoly for B&O in terms of having rail service come into DC that they couldn't really get around. And second, the original contract for this railroad, which is now called the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad, was really only to Pope's Creek. Now, at this time, it's also important to note that the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad was being bought up by the Pennsylvania Railroad and was essentially acting as a wing of that growing railroad empire. And there you can see the logo right there. But the brilliant minds at the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad found a loophole. That is the only fun graphic in today's presentation. What was their loophole? Well, they realized that the contract said that they had to make sure their main line went to Pope's Creek. It said nothing about having a branch line go into the city. Now, of course, this branch line could have more service and serve the larger market, but as long as they still considered their main trackage going to Pope's Creek, they were in the clear. This is exactly what they did. And in 1872, they opened their branch line, as they had to keep stating over and over again, to the Baltimore Potomac station just north of the National Mall, crossing the Anacostia River on the Anacostia River Bridge, going underground a little bit through the Virginia Avenue Tunnel, and eventually reaching the station. Again, here it is, a nice photo of that, which is currently the site of the National Gallery of Art. Now, after all this time, there was still a lot of competition going on with the B&O, and things, unfortunately, would only get uglier.
Much uglier. So, for this part, we're going to jump through time a little bit. I think it's just important that we got a clear sense of who those two competitors were. So, crossing the Potomac is actually one of the most important things that happened to DC railways, because that allowed trains from the north to go south, trains from the south to go north. But the Potomac River was a big obstacle, one that had no crossing. So, as early as the 1830s, there were already railroads in Richmond. Like once that B&O opened, it was like an explosion. Like there were railroads everywhere. They went to Richmond, and then a company known as the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac built tracks to, is it Aquia Creek? Aquia.
There you go.
American English makes no sense.
No.
There, you would get on a ferry. So the train would take you to the creek, you would get on the ferry, that would take you to the District of Columbia, which is, a cumbersome process, but at least you could get there. Eventually, they did build a bridge. The first long bridge is actually the oldest piece of infrastructure we're talking about today, opened in 1809, but it was not a railroad bridge. Quick aside, why is it called the Long Bridge? Well, there was another bridge at the location where today's Chain Bridge is. That one was shorter, this one was longer. Long Bridge, but like I said, no trains on them. So, and that was actually a rule imposed by Virginia. They did not want tracks on the bridge. Now, this bridge became incredibly important during the Civil War because, as you probably know, Washington was the capital of the Union, Richmond was the capital of the Confederation. So that Potomac River is the border between these two warring sides, and whoever has control of the bridge has a huge advantage. So the Union built a fort called Fort Jackson to protect the bridge from Confederate spies. And that's at the location that today is Long Bridge Park, where those soccer fields are. That used to be a fort. And what they were protecting was a tiny little railroad known as the Alexandria and Washington, which built tracks from Alexandria to the Virginia side of the Potomac, and then they built tracks from the Baltimore and Ohio to kind of where East Potomac Park is today. And if we go back for just a sec, so because there were no tracks on the bridge, what you would have to do is the train would go to the shore, they would unload everything, put it on these really wobbly carts, bring it over the bridge, and then put it back on a train. So they wanted tracks on the bridge. They installed some, and I believe the bridge collapsed.
Yeah.
It was not strong enough. So they built a second long bridge with train tracks. That was in 1872, which, remember, is the same year that the Pennsylvania Railroad first came to DC. Now that they had kind of won the fight about coming into DC, they started a fight about crossing the river. So initially, both railroads were allowed to use the bridge, and it was owned by the Baltimore and Ohio. So I can't even express how important this was for American history in general. For the first time, products from the South could go to the harbors of Baltimore, New York, and Boston. But the Pennsylvania Railroad, they wanted all of that money. If we go to the next slide. So we have the situation where they're sharing the bridge, and actually trains coming from Maryland would take Virginia Avenue into DC, and trains going from DC to Virginia would take Maryland Avenue. But not for long, thanks to these two guys. This is Simon Cameron. He was briefly the Secretary of War under Abraham Lincoln until he was removed from office for being corrupt. And so then he became a senator for 30 years.
Nothing bad's gonna happen.
No. Once you hear these stories, you'll be glad that there's no more corruption in DC. Simon Cameron was also, he owned stock in the Pennsylvania Railroad. So he was a senator from Pennsylvania, he was a stockholder, and so he basically got the Pennsylvania Railroad to get full control of the bridge. But that's fine, the Baltimore and Ohio could still run over it. Well, no, thanks to Mr. Alexander Roby Shepherd, also known as Boss Shepherd. Now, he was on the Board of Public Works. I believe he also briefly served as governor. He had some good ideas, had some really bad ideas. Washington was not a pleasant place to live in the 1870s. It was dirty, it was dangerous, and a lot of stuff had fallen into disrepair because of poor spending. The previous mayor of DC had had all his furniture seized in an attempt to pay off some of his debts. So what Boss Shepherd realized is that DC needed a big public works program. So that meant better streets, cleaner streets, and that meant no more trains running down streets. So overnight, they just ripped out the tracks that the Baltimore and Ohio had between their station and the bridge, so that there was now no longer a connection that they could make into Virginia. Boss Shepherd's crazy spending, by the way, is the reason why DC lost home rule for a century. So look, Baltimore and Ohio, you're coming from New York, you're coming from Chicago, and there's no way to get into Virginia. What do? Well, they had to build an alternative. So they built what's known as the Alexandria Extension. So if we follow that middle blue line, right? You're coming from Baltimore. You're going into the station. Then you have to back out all the way until you reach Hyattsville, then curve down to what is today Deanwood, go through Anacostia until you're right on a track that ironically is called the Shepherd Industrial Spur.
No relation.
No relation.
Yeah.
The cars would then be put on a boat, floated across the river to Alexandria, put back on tracks, and then continue into Virginia. So who would pick that over just taking a train across the bridge? Nobody. So it was a very bad time for Baltimore and Ohio, and the Pennsylvania Railroad they won. Finally, one more thing about crossing the river. Now that it was under Pennsylvania Railroad control, they eventually did give a different railroad permission to use it, a trolley railroad. So from Mount Vernon to DC, these trolleys ran on electric power, and so the Long Bridge, which is not electric today, actually briefly was electric, and it was trains and trolleys that shared the bridge together.
All right, but now we've covered sort of the two larger empires of railroads that hit the DC region. We thought we'd quickly do a pause to just share some information about some of the smaller railroads that are in DC, Maryland, Virginia. The first one we'll talk about, one of the early ones, all the way in 1848, is the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, where in this case, there's no foolery here. It did go between Alexandria to Orange, Virginia, with a later extension to Lynchburg. This rail line became extremely important in the Civil War because it was part of the connection from the northern capital of Washington to the Confederate capital of Richmond. So you can sort of see there a little bit of a, here we go, a little bit of a Y connected to a different railroad here, and was frequently fought over multiple times during the Civil War. It would eventually be consumed by the Southern Railway much later in its life.
One of the ones that I think is the most interesting is the Washington and Old Dominion. This ran from Alexandria to a tiny place in the Blue Ridge Mountains called Bluemont via places like Ashburn, Leesburg, Purcellville. And eventually there was also a branch that went to Georgetown, and so trains would start at that car barn that Joe told us about. They would cross the river through Roslyn, Falls Church, and then eventually go basically the route that the Silver Line takes today, but deep into the mountains. And exactly. A few interesting things about it. First of all, there was a section where it actually crossed the highway. That's in like Shirlington. The crossing doesn't exist anymore. And it was electric for part of its history. So there's this thing called an interurban, which is kind of a cross between a trolley and a train. And so you could get on an electric train in Georgetown, in Roslyn, and take it all the way like into the mountains. I've done the whole route. I was just at the end of the line on Monday, and it is incredible to think that standing there, you could have gotten on a train to Roslyn.
And one of my favorite of the smaller railroads in the DC region was the way that a lot of Washingtonians would get to the beach, which honestly would be a great idea after today's presentation, given how hot it is. But the Chesapeake Beach Railroad was opened in 1898. Oh, let's get that fixed. And was never actually financially profitable. It only lasted giving passenger service until 1935, when a brief portion was kept alive into the 70s just to do freight service in the Deanwood area of DC. But it's a fun little idea to imagine that one day there was a time when you could board a train in DC and take it to some fun in the sun and some aquatic activities.
All right, and the last branch that we're going to talk about wasn't actually its own railroad, and what we call it today is also not what it was called. It's the Capitol Crescent, so it's that blue arch that you see going from Silver Spring to Bethesda to Georgetown. It was officially called the Georgetown Branch, and it was owned by the Baltimore and Ohio. So the Georgetown waterfront today is like a very hip, like cool, nice place to be. There's restaurants, there's a marina for boats, but for a long time, that was an ugly, stinky, messy rail yard. So you can see in this photo, that's the Whitehurst Freeway, and the tracks ran right underneath it, and they went right up into the water. And so freight trains would go from the B&O main line, and they would branch off, kind of traveling past where the Sibley Hospital is today into Georgetown. And one particularly interesting project that these trains contributed to was the construction of the Lincoln Memorial. So the Lincoln Memorial is, it's a lot of marble, and that was transported via train. So they actually built tracks along Virginia Avenue in Foggy Bottom that were temporary, all the way up until where the Lincoln Memorial is today. They ran trains to bring that rock to the construction site, and as soon as the project was done, the tracks were ripped up again. But if you're walking there, there used to be trains there.
All right, so towards the beginning of the 20th century, the two larger empires of railroads, to go back to those two, the B&O and the Pennsylvania Railroad, did start to see some value in working together. And one of the places where they first started this, and perhaps the one that's left the greatest mark on DC, is Washington Union Station, as we heard a little bit in the past presentation. The station was opened in 1908 and was probably one of the best works of Daniel Burnham, its architect. It was a key component of the aforementioned Macmillan Plan that sought to beautify the city throughout the National Mall all the way to the train station. Its opening represented a significant improvement to DC, not just because it was a monumental Beaux Arts station in the middle of the city, a monumental moment, if you will, but because it really solved a lot of the problems of the older terminals. If we look back at this map here, where we can see, this is before they ripped up all the tracks out of spite for the B&O, but the New Jersey Avenue station and the B&P station for the B&O and the Pennsylvania Railroads both had trains running on the street. And even worse, sometimes trains running on the National Mall, which was a dirty and dangerous situation that resulted in all sorts of problems, as you can imagine. With Union Station, on the other hand, you now had grade-separated tracks running to the station and then running into a tunnel, actually right by the Capitol and the Supreme Court. I don't know if you could ever do that today. Then down across the Long Bridge to other points south. Now the station opens and it solves another issue, one that was also mentioned in the last presentation, where at the B&P station, over there in the National Mall where the National Gallery of Art sits today, was the site of the assassination of Garfield back in 1881. And now with, there we go, it's a ghost of Garfield, oh my God. And now Union Station sought to fix this problem by this area of the station, this east side, is actually home to the Presidential Club Room, where the President of the United States, back when they took trains a lot more often, would use this as a safe passage to get into the station. I believe it's for rent right now, so if you want to have a party there, I believe you could have a party there right now.
They had a rave there a few years ago.
They had a rave there?
Yeah.
Yeah, go as wild as you want, I guess. But, and then a couple more interesting facts about Union Station while we're here, and I'll use the pointer here. If you're in the main hall, which is such a lovely place to be, you might have seen these statues of the Roman legionnaires that line up the station. Well, if you're ever to, have extra time or something, maybe your train's delayed, could be a possibility, you could count them all, and you would realize that there are 46 of these statues that represent the 46 states that were in existence at the time of the station's opening. I think the exceptions were New Mexico, Arizona, Alaska, Hawaii. Those were the ones that didn't exist, and they never thought they'd add any more states, so they put 46 statues. And the final thing I'll mention, and this will take some real eagle eyes here, you might notice that these statues have little shields here. Now, the little shields were not original to the sculptor. The sculptor wanted to go full Greek, full Roman, show the whole statue, everything laid bare, and they were given a profound rejection, and last minute had to add what are, quote, modesty shields to protect the public of Union Station from something so horrible like that. And the last thing I'll mention is this area right here underneath the clock. It's a space that hasn't really been used for much in recent years, but it used to be. It used to be the main restaurant for Union Station that opened with the restaurant. And I think something really important about this space is that when it opened and throughout its life, it was one of the few places in DC, one of the few restaurants, if not the only restaurant in DC, to have an integrated place to sit. Back during the era of Jim Crow, so many of the restaurants in DC were segregated. That was never the case at DC's Union Station.
Yay.
So there was a new tunnel that was built under the Supreme Court. There were new tracks that had to be built so that the trains could reach Union Station, and those were all the responsibility of a newly founded company known as the Washington Terminal Company. Now, they were co-owned by several of the different railroads that shared Union Station. All of those railroads are gone. They've been absorbed into other companies, but the Washington Terminal Company still exists, and it is actually like 99.999% owned by Amtrak as one of their only two subsidiaries that they have. So, on the passenger side, Union Station was the big collaboration. On the freight side, that was Potomac Yard. Now, you might hear Potomac Yard and think, hey, that's the newest metro station. Correct. That was built on the site where the yard formerly stood. Now, Potomac Yard was built as a compromise for all these railroads to work together and to allow the Baltimore and Ohio to finally use the bridge again. What it essentially did was when freight would come from the north on the northern railroads. It would come to Potomac Yard, and then it would be put onto trains going south. So this was the biggest and most important rail yard in the eastern United States for that very reason. It really acts as the border between north and south. The neighborhoods, so here's like an older picture of Potomac Yard. That W&OD railroad I told you about earlier had a bridge that was straight across the yard. And like the scale of this thing just cannot be overstated. There were whole neighborhoods that were built in Alexandria, like Delray and St. Elmo, that were just neighborhoods for yard laborers to live in and to raise their families in. And these are some of the most charming neighborhoods that Alexandria has today, which is saying a lot because Alexandria is great. And most interestingly, many people probably know that the Northeast Corridor, which is now an Amtrak line, but back in the day was a Pennsylvania Railroad line, is electrified. That happened in the 1930s. But what a lot of people don't know is that besides running electric passenger trains, they also ran electric freight trains. And those ran electric all the way until Potomac Yard. So Potomac Yard was fully electrified. They would have these electric locomotives bring the cars there, and then a diesel locomotive from one of the southern railways would take over. And so, yeah, Virginia very briefly had electric rail.
Now, as we go a little further in time, we get to World War II, and with the coming of the Second World War, there was a lot more demand for the movement of military goods and troops. With that came some new temporary infrastructure to the region. The most important, but probably the least talked about, is something called the Emergency Bridge. Now, we'll go back to this map and we'll talk once again about, I think, our favorite piece of railroad history, that Shepherd Industrial Spur here, made to get around, the B&O made it to get around the issues with the Long Bridge. And so back in the 1940s and the early 1940s, at the onset of World War II, people in the government really thought that there was going to be a high chance that Nazi saboteurs would try to blow up the Long Bridge. And in doing so, cut off a vital connection between, again, as Thomas mentioned, the North and the South, so important for the war effort. So what did they do? Well, they first realized that, look, there was a second way to get across the Potomac, but it used to involve a train car ferry. So what they did instead is they decided to build a second bridge across the Potomac for trains, right on the path of where the train car ferry used to be. And they built it in 9 months, opening, I believe, in 1942. You can see some images, which are pretty hard to find. There aren't that many images of it because it only lasted until 1947 and actually stopped service back in 1945, as would make sense given that was the end of the war. It never saw that much traffic, but it did serve as critical redundancy in case someone had blown up the Long Bridge. Here's another photo right there.
All right. So we've talked about several presidents that have taken trains. There was Abraham Lincoln, there was James Garfield, who never made it on the train, and there was FDR. So Franklin Roosevelt was president during World War II, and it was his responsibility to try to end World War II. And so he had to do that in deliberation with other world leaders like Winston Churchill, like Joseph Stalin. And so what ended up happening was he had to meet with Churchill in Casablanca, Morocco. How to sneak the president out of Washington, D.C. is an excellent question because they didn't want anybody to know what he was going to do in case things went south. So he went in a car from the White House to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, where he was going to go on like an inspection tour. Under the Bureau is a track, and in that track was a rail car known as the Ferdinand Magellan, which he secretly boarded, and in the dark of night, they went over the Long Bridge and all the way to Miami, where he got on a seaplane to Casablanca, where he met with Winston Churchill, and that meeting is credited as one of the first domino stones in ending World War II. So that happened right under everybody's noses here in Washington, D.C.
Now, like most railroads in the United States in the 50s and particularly the 60s and onward, there was a decline for the railroads here in D.C. Both intercity passenger services on a lot of short lines ended up getting shut down completely. Even our beautiful Union Station got carved out back in the bicentennial of 1976 to build what was called the Pit, which was a very ill-fated National Park Service project to show like an introduction, a Washington Welcome Center, but unfortunately it showed imagery of the very monuments you could just walk out of Union Station and see for yourself. And so unfortunately never did well. It was a cool concept. And so after that, Rural Union Station fell into decline. It was very emblematic of a lot of the issues facing passenger rail in America until thankfully in the 80s, it got fully restored and it's in the splendor it has today. All the intercity passenger services would ultimately go to Amtrak. All the commuter rail services would wind up going to MARC, run by Maryland DOT, and the Virginia Railway Express, run by Virginia.
One little bright spot in that history, though, is that the Beatles played their very first concert in the United States at the Uline Arena in what's today Noma. And why is that important? Well, they were supposed to fly there from New York City, but the weather was so bad that they had to take the train. So the Beatles took the train for their first US concert, which was right here in Washington, D.C.
Huh.
So yeah, there's Amtrak, MARC, VRE, I believe is the latest edition. So all those services used to be privately run, as they were in the rest of the country and the rest of the world, really. But now different government institutions are funding them to make sure that people who don't drive for whatever reason still have a way to travel in and out of the city. Although there are way less destinations you can get to today than you could 80 years ago.
And of course, there's so much more history we could talk about given the railways of DC and how comprehensive they were around the region. But we thought since we're bumping up against the present day, we'd sort of shift over to start talking about what things you can see out in the DC region to go explore some of the railway history that we just went over. Probably the most obvious way is to go explore the stations that are still active, that we still have and cherish to this day. You can go look at the Mossy Shields if you want in Washington Union Station. You can go ride the Virginia Railway Express. You can go ride Amtrak to all the points you want to go to. But we'll also start to show you some of the stations that you might not have known about or have been abandoned and don't serve as passenger rail stations anymore. The first one we'll take a look at is there Oh my God, fantastic. Yeah. Well, the Silver Spring Station, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad station on the Metropolitan Branch, opened in 1945, sadly closed in 2000 when they moved the MARC service, the commuter rail service, a little further north to be more conjoined with the Metro and future Purple Line stations over there in Silver Spring. It's a beautiful little station right from its era, and you can still see it to this day right over there, I believe by by Georgia Avenue, right around there.
Where's Truman? Truman liked to sneak out. He didn't want to go to Union Station because he'd be hounded by the press, so he would sneak out here.
There's presidential history all over the place. That's wonderful.
He should have gone to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing.
That's the green line, I swear.
Well, further north.
It's actually a joke because they have a cutout of Truman in the building.
Oh my God, that's fantastic. And then a similar story that we have on the same branch, on the Metropolitan Branch for the Baltimore, Ohio, is the original Rockville station from 1873, which suffered a similar fate in that they built the Metro. They wanted to build a consolidated Metro, MARC, Amtrak station over there out of concrete, so there was no more use or space for the original 1873 station. But what they did here is they literally lifted onto wheels and wheeled it down a few blocks south, where it currently sits today as a law firm.
So that Washington and Old Dominion Railroad has so many preserved stations, and they're all very easy to visit. One is in Vienna. It hosts the Model Railroad Club today. There's one in Hamilton, which I believe doesn't do very much anymore, but it's still there. You've got one in Purcellville. You've also got them in Round Hill, Bluemont, Herndon, lots of different places. And the one in Purcellville is a tourist information office. It's never open when I'm there, but you can peek in the windows and you can see what it looked like. Now the W&OD stations were in Virginia, and what that meant was that every station building had 2 rooms because of segregation. So the buildings, they all have kind of a similar pattern where there's kind of a central section, and then there's a white side and a black people side. And it's been preserved that way as a way to commemorate that darker part of history.
And now moving away from stations to some other forms of evidence of the past railway history of our region, a lot of places you might find trails as a great example of ways to experience the railroads that are no longer here today.
So that includes the W&OD Trail, which is a lot of people's favorite because it's 45 miles of the original right-of-way. Really, there's just parts in Alexandria and parts beyond Purcellville that are missing. It's fully paved, in some parts even pedestrian and cyclist separated. And along the way, you will find a ton of different features of that railroad. They really only took away what they absolutely had to. So this is in Clark's Gap. It's a bridge that goes over the road. A lot of the bridges on the trail still use the original abutments. And in Falls Church, you have this structure right alongside the trail. That is a coal trestle. So trains would be pushed up that. The bottoms would open, all the coal would be dumped into a chute. And they started tearing some of it down to build like a self-storage, and then the preservationists stepped in, and the rest of it has been kept in this shape.
Another one of the trails that's actually very well known in the DC region that was once a railroad right-of-way is the Capitol Crescent Trail, opened in 1996, running from Bethesda all the way down to Georgetown. Maybe someone, has anyone here ridden on either the Capitol Crescent? How about the WNOD for that matter? Anyone been on that? Oh, it's great. So people have experience with that. You got some great tunnels, you got some great bridges, and what I love about this, just like the WNOD, so many examples of its past use. My favorite one is this bridge in Bethesda, a little south of the main CBD there, where you can still see, I don't know if you can make it out, the old B&O logo right there with the Capitol building, the Capitol Dome, and the year that that railroad bridge was built. A smaller trail, I don't know, has anyone been to this one before? No, some people, great. This is the Wilk Street Tunnel, built all the way back in 1856 by the Alexandria and Orange Railway to get through a last little hump to get to the Alexandria waterfront. It's not very long, but if you get the chance on a day like today, it's significantly cooler in that tunnel.
I went down.
Right, and there is one more section of abandoned railway that is actually still being used. And so the WNOD, it went through Falls Church on its way from Arlington to Vienna, and when it closed down, the Virginia Highway Authority really wanted that right-of-way through Falls Church. And they basically negotiated a deal where the highway would get to use the route if they could build tracks in the middle. So when you're riding the orange or silver lines, for a very short section, you are actually still running on the Old Washington and Old Dominion.
And we get
Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis.
Right, there are some trails out, I believe, to the east with that too. We couldn't fit everything in here, but we're getting into the miscellaneous categories. Who knows what we might be about to share here with other ways to look at right-of-way. And I find this really fascinating because we'll find evidence of our past railroad history in places you might not expect, places like the urban form and even just looking on Google Earth. We come back to Potomac Yard. This is an image we shared before, Tom, who gave a great history of it. Now, the yard eventually closed in 1989. Now, I want you to focus your eyes on the yellow line here. That's the boundary between the yard and the development in neighborhoods to the left. And when we go to a modern image of what the area looks like today, you can still see small pieces of evidence of how far that yard extended, whether it's this tree line or the fact that you can still see how much newer a lot of the development is where the yard used to be. Whoa, geez, okay. Where the yard, yeah, again, the ghost of the Potomac Yard.
Gives us more
you
time.
have the newer development here built over the past few decades. And so that's just another example of ways you can see the railroad history in some lesser known ways. One of my favorite ways to see this is in the Deanwood neighborhood around Nannie Helen Burroughs Avenue Northeast in Northeast DC, where if you look here very carefully, you'll notice that there are two types of housing in this satellite imagery. You'll see the first type are your pre-war duplexes and townhomes, and the second type are these ranch homes that look a little bit out of place, almost haphazardly put. Now I'm going to go back here just to show you, if you start to look at where these ranch homes are placed, they seem to form some sort of line that becomes a lot more evident when you look at the DC property map. And you see the property lines has an elegant curve that seems to look like a railroad right-of-way, and that's because that's exactly what it is. It's my favorite Chesapeake Beach Railway that was abandoned again in the 30s and 40s, and what did they do? They sold it off to property developers to turn them to housing, which is why they're so different from the housing that they're around. And there you go. And the final thing we'll talk about in terms of these sort of other ways of looking at right-of-way is our favorite, the Shepherd Industrial Spur. It was a way for the B&O to basically find a loophole, or a way to get around, I should say, the restrictions on the Long Bridge. It was abandoned ultimately in the 80s and the early 2000s, but it sees a second life as the DC streetcar, as the first line of an intended ambitious network of streetcar lines around DC. We all know how successful this program was. But fortunately, they started building and constructing the Anacostia line on the old right-of-way of the Shepherd Industrial Spur. Why? Because it was easier to build it there for many other reasons. But, you know, as we know the story of the streetcar, for those of you who are aware, this never saw any passenger service. It might be one of the few rail lines, certainly one of the few in DC, to be abandoned twice.
And a funny story about that is that there was a dispute about who actually owned it, which is one of the reasons why it was built, because CSX suddenly said, hey, no, that's actually ours, and you need to pay us for it.
Yes.
A few other things that are left around the city. Yeah.
This is one fun one. If you go to where the Northeast Corridor crosses Bladenburg Road Northeast, right where US 50 comes in before Ivy City, you'll find on this bridge, you can still see the old owner of the Northeast Corridor, the Pennsylvania Railroad, still painted in its original livery.
So I mentioned that Potomac Yard was electric, but once Potomac Yard was no longer needed because the railroads on both sides were owned by the same company, that company, CSX, started running diesel trains. Passenger trains are diesel here, so there's no more need for electrification between DC and Potomac Yard. But removing those gantries is expensive, and why would you do that if you don't absolutely need to? So if you're in L'Enfant, or if you're on both sides of the Anacostia River, or even some parts of Northern Virginia, you will still see those masts that held the electric wires up. This is a building next to McPherson Square known as the Southern Railway Building. We didn't talk about the Southern very much, but they basically ran from DC all the way to Atlanta, points beyond. This was their office building, their headquarters. They only moved to Norfolk, Virginia, not like in the grand scheme of things very recently, because they got taken over by Norfolk Southern. And there's another building just like this on the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and 6th Street. This is the Atlantic Coastline Ticket Office. So back when the internet was not a thing, you would have to buy physical tickets, and you could do that for the Atlantic Coastline specifically at this building. Now they kept it up, they built a building around it. I believe it hosts federal offices now, but it's still one of the many reminders of one of the railroads that came through DC. Now there's one more thing that we didn't include a picture of, but has anybody ever drank a bottle of Deer Park water?
Yes,
Yes.
my grandfather had it.
Deer Park was created and owned by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And it still exists today.
And I think with that, hopefully you now have some ideas of where you can go and see some evidence of the railways of DC. Thank you so much.
Thom and Andy for a great presentation. I know it is insanely hot in here,
Yes.
so what we are going to do for the Q&A, we'll have Thom and Andy. They'll take a quick step outside. They'll be in the main hall there, so you're welcome to go up, meet them, say hello, and ask all the questions you want. There's give them a quick minute to go and get set up. Before then, we just want to present each of them with a gift from us here at the Trolley Museum in appreciation for the presentations. A copy of Peter Kohler's Capital Transit, the end-all, be-all for all of the things on DC streetcars. Copies of this book are available in the museum
Thank
gift
you very
shop.
much.
And then we also have for them, as with our other speakers, posters commemorating their presentations here this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
So again, thank you everybody for coming and joining us here at Monumental Moments. As I mentioned, Thom and Andy will be outside to answer all the questions that you have in just a minute.